We greet you one and all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And this Mother's Day, as we celebrate Mother's Day, I wish to express to each and every one of you to whom it rightly applies, Happy Mother's Day to you. May you be blessed, especially under the current situation. If you would be kind enough to turn with me an Old Testament book, the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, the first chapter, and actually the entire first chapter of 22 verses is important, but we're going to read just the first 13 verses, and encourage you to read the balance as soon as possible. I'm excited about coming before you on this Mother's Day once again, and this is from the book of Ruth, the first chapter, the first 13 verses, that says unto us and speaks unto us, Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to journey in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of the 2 sons was Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab, and the name of the one was Oprah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the women were left with her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose, that is, Naomi arose, and went with her daughter-in-laws that they might return to the country of Moab. For she had heard that in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Wherefore they went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughter-in-laws with her. And they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. And Naomi said unto her 2 daughter-in-laws, Go, return each of you to your mother's house. And the Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. And they said unto her, Surely we will return with thee unto thy people. And Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters. Will you go with me, and there be yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would you tarry with them until they are grown? Will you stay for them from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sake, that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. And it grieveth me much for your sake, that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. When life becomes bitter. The story of Naomi. When life becomes bitter. The story of Naomi. Her name is Naomi, which means admirable, my pleasant one, my sweet one. But what happens? What happens when my pleasant one, what happens when my sweet one, what happens when life becomes bitter? For I am convinced that the adversities of life will make us either better or bitter. And therefore, just in case you have run into or will run into adversity, I wanted to spend a few moments with Naomi, that she might share with us her experience when life becomes bitter. Now, it came to pass, the record reveals, in the day when the judges, that there was a famine in the land. Now, of course, the day of the judges was a miserable period of Israel's history when vicious cycles kept repeating itself, with the people falling into idolatry, God letting their enemies oppress them, then they crying out for deliverance, God raising up a judge to rescue them, and then them falling again into idolatry. At some point during those days, a famine as a result occurred. And as a result of the famine, a certain man from Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, I would suggest to you, first of all, the fact that there was a famine in the land during the days of the judges strongly suggests that this was an act of divine judgment. For the time of the judges, a time when every man did as was right in his own eyes, was a time of spiritual decadence and moral decay. And so it would not be surprising, it really would not be surprising to find that that land was overgoing and undergoing famine during such a time when God had promised chastisement for disobedience. And the famine was identified as one of God's judgments, or one of the judgments that God would bring upon his people if they became unfaithful. Ironically, this famine in Judah included the town of Bethlehem, which means in Hebrew, the house of bread, suggesting that there was normally a fertile land, or Bethlehem was a fertile region. Yet Bethlehem, the place where he who is the bread of life was to be born, was now encountering a famine. Or imagine, if you will, there being no bread in a place whose name means house of bread. It's also ironic that Elimelech, a man whose name means God is my king, signifying a devout commitment to God as king, it is ironic that he failed to trust God to provide during this time of famine. For I heard the psalmist, I heard the psalmist declare, behold, the eye of the Lord is upon them that fear him, upon them that hope in his mercy, to deliver their soul from death and to keep them alive in famine. Oh, they should have been ashamed in an evil time, that the day of famine they shall be satisfied. But instead of trusting God, Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons left the house of bread and went to journey in the country of Moab. The family, this family from Bethlehem of the tribe of Judah, moved to the neighboring country of Moab to escape the famine. He must not have known. He must not have known that it is better to be hungry in the will of God than it is to have a full stomach outside of God's will. Now clearly Elimelech had no intentions initially of staying in Moab forever. It was just to be for a while during the time of the famine. For we are told that they initially went and they sojourned or lodged there. Have the very next verse indicate that they went into the country of Moab and they continued there, or they settled there. Or it really was to be a temporary relocation, but they stayed too long. For we are told that while they were in the country of Moab, that Elimelech died. And Naomi was left alone in Moab with her 2 sons. Now the cause of his death is unknown. We're not told what it was, but the adverse effects of his death is clearly known. We don't know why he died, but we know that it affected Naomi and her sons greatly. For thus, for a woman to be left alone without her husband in her own community was serious enough. But to be so left in another land would place her in desperate situation. Now, I shared with you that the meaning of Naomi's name, as well as the name of her now deceased husband, but I did fail to tell you that the meaning of her 1 son, Mahlon, is sickly or frail. And the name of the other son, Chilion, is failing or weak. How appropriate were those names? For after the death of their father, these 2 boys took wives of the women of Moab. Chilion married a woman by the name of Oprah, and Mahlon married Ruth. And I'm reminded that both of these boys were Israelites, and that both of these women were Moabites. And I'm convinced that the marriage, though not strictly forbidden, was indeed frowned upon. Now, the concern being that such marriage involved the temptation to serve foreign gods of these foreign wives, and that's why maybe it was not strictly forbidden, but it was frowned upon. And these marriages didn't last long, though, because we're told that after living in Moab for about 10 years, Mahlon and his brother Chilion, like their father, died. Just like their father, these 2 boys also died. Naomi, though widowed in a foreign land, still had hope while her two sons were yet alive. However, when they died without children, much of her hope also died. We're told now, not long after Naomi's sons were married to these two Moabite women, that they were told that they dwelled in Moab, and they dwelled there for about 10 years. Now, initially they went to Moab, you remember, initially they went there and they sojourned there. But we are then told that they continued there, and now we are told that they dwelled there. It would seem that they were apparently given up all thoughts. It would appear that they had given up all thoughts of returning to Bethlehem. And so Naomi was left without her husband, and without her sons, and without any grandchildren, and apparently without any hope. All of this had happened in a foreign land, far from the support of those who spoke her language or who worshiped her God. She was left completely destitute, a widow and childless, and her two daughter-in-laws who were also themselves now widows and childless. And so Naomi heard that the Lord had visited his people in Israel, giving them bread. And when she heard this, she arose that she might return home. With her two widowed, childless daughter-in-laws, Naomi took and left the place where she was and began setting out in a direction that would take her back home to Judah. She learned that the famine in Bethlehem, that the famine had ended in Bethlehem, and so she prepared to return home. Naomi assumed that these two women, her daughter-in-laws, would remain in their native land of Moab and find security there by remarrying and having children with Moabite husbands. And so after they had sojourned for a distance, Naomi spoke to both Oprah and Ruth, insisting, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house." She tried to dissuade them. She tried to dissuade them from following her on a journey that would promise them so very little. This mother-in-law attempts to release Oprah and Ruth from any obligation to her by encouraging them to stay instead in Moab, since she cannot provide for her widowed daughters-in-law. She begs them to instead go back home. They apparently had been loving wives, and Naomi appreciated their affection for her, and hence she prayed, "May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown unto your dead," or to my two dead sons, "as well as you've shown unto me. May the Lord grant that you find rest, each of you in the house of your new husbands." Now, the first part of Naomi's benediction was a prayer that the Lord would deal kindly with these two young widows as they had dealt kindly with their first husbands, as well as to her. Naomi now expressed hope that the Lord's covenant love would extend to her daughter-in-laws, despite the fact that they were Moabites, And despite the fact that they lived outside of the land of Israel. The second part of the benediction was an expression of Naomi's hope that the Lord would grant to each of these women that they would find rest in another husband's home. In other words, this rest implied the stability and the security that marriage provided for women of that day. For you see, even in her own desperate situation, Naomi was not selfish, but selfless. Oh, it could have been that en route. It really could have been that en route that Naomi reflected on her own journey to Moab, a journey that had left her empty in an alien name. And so rather than visit the same fate as her young women who would be aliens in Israel, she insisted that instead of experiencing her fate, they would instead stay in their own land. Well, we're told that she then kissed them. She then kissed them, and they wept aloud, indicating the great affection between this Israelite woman and her two childless Gentile widows. They could not contain their emotions any longer. All three of them lifted up their voice and wept. Now, of course, Naomi's kisses were intended to express goodbye. But Oprah and Ruth both insisted, surely we will return with thee unto thy people. Both refused at that moment to be separated from Naomi. They pledged themselves instead to return to Judah with her. This was a tribute. This indeed was a tribute to the godly character of Naomi, that her two daughter-in-laws were prepared to leave their own land and go back with her to Judah. But yet for a second time, Naomi urges these two wives of her now deceased sons to return home, my daughter. Why would you go with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? To stay with Naomi pointed out, would be senseless. She was too old, she indicated, to give birth to sons that these younger women might marry to replace their now deceased husband. And this, of course, refers to an ancient custom that expressly authorized by the law of Moses, which required that a younger son, if one existed, to marry the widow of his deceased brother, if that brother died without having or fathering a son. This law provided that if a man's brother dies without a son, that man should take the widow to wife, and that the first son that she bare to him would be counted as the son of his now deceased brother. But no such brother existed. This law was designed to keep the widow from poverty and provide a way for the family name of the first husband to be preserved. And so Naomi demands for the third time, return home, my daughters, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they were grown up? Would you remain unmarried for them? Even if I had more sons, which I really never will, Would you wait for them to grow up? Nay, my daughters. For the third time, Naomi affectionately refers to Ruth and Oprah as my daughters. She refers to them as my daughters for the third time instead of referring to them as daughter-in-laws. This manifest love, which united the hearts of these grieving women, is brilliantly portrayed by these sobbing words of Naomi. For it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. Naomi expresses her bitterness. She expresses her bitterness regarding the fact that she was without husband, without sons, without grandchildren, and she attributes her circumstances to God's discipline. She determined that her personal losses proved that God had turned away from her. And so she tells her Gentile daughter-in-laws that there is much bitterness. There is more bitterness for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me. He is the one. He is the one. God is the one who has permitted this evil. That God is the one who gave his divine permission for the famine. That God is the one who caused the sudden death of my husband. That God is the one who took my two dear sons. That God is the one who is now requiring me to separate from my daughters. When life becomes bitter, you and I, we have a tendency to blame God. For He is the one who is in control, is He not? He is the one who is sovereign, is He not? He is the one who is almighty, is He not? He is the one who has all authority, does He not? He is the one. So why should I not be bitter? Why should I not be angry? Why should I not be wounded? Why should I not be hurt? When life becomes bitter, what else is a person to do? Well, I hate to leave you like this. I really hate to leave you like this and not answer those questions. But my brothers and my sisters, until next week, let me simply tell you that God is in control. Let me simply tell you that God is sovereign. Let me simply tell you that God is almighty. Let me simply tell you that God is faithful, that God is merciful, that God is gracious, that God is loving, that God is all-knowing, that God is true to His word. And so don't give up. Please don't give up on God. Don't give up on God even when life becomes bitter. Until next week, either in this format or once we're able to assemble ourselves again at the Zion Hill Baptist Church, 220 Jefferson Street, Youngstown, Ohio. Be blessed. God is not against you. He has a divine plan for you. He is at work on your behalf. Be blessed. Happy Mother's Day. And may God continue to bless you and keep you, is our prayer. Amen and amen.
Jesus.